May these words be spoken and heard in the power of love. Amen. Please be seated. I'm sure, like me, you've started to receive those annual Christmas report cards which family and friends send us to tell us what's been happening in their lives. Or perhaps, like me, you've not got organised enough this year to write yours. So then when each one comes, you have to write a special response to each person, just saying a few bits of the story that you think may be relevant to them. And my thoughts this morning are really centred around one such message which I received from a friend. He's actually a Palestinian Anglican priest from the village of Beit Yosef, which likes to think it's the hometown of Josephus. Probably wasn't, but they like to think that. And he's now teaching at a university in the United Kingdom. And he wrote his Christmas letter and sent out to colleagues and family and friends. And I'm fortunate to be one of those friends to whom he sent his note. Like many such letters this year, he noted the loss of an aged member of his family, in this case his grandmother, who was from Nazareth and had died in Nazareth. I think from memory she was about 94 years of age when she died a couple of months ago. Because of COVID, of course, he was not able to go back from the United Kingdom to Israel to be with her prior to her death, nor indeed to participate or even to take her funeral, as I'm sure he would have wanted to do as the only priest, I'm sure, in that immediate family. So he was reflecting a little bit on his grandmother and how in many ways she had been the person who shaped him and formed him as a child of faith and continued to be, as he said, his prayer warrior right up until the end of her life. So a very close, affectionate bond between my friend and his grandmother in Nazareth. It's not because of the Nazareth connection, even though it's Christmas, it's not because of the Nazareth connection that I'm mentioning this. But he talked about the way his grandmother had lived the faith and had lived the incarnation, had in a sense reincarnated, if you like, lived the reality of the incarnation that we celebrate at Christmas. And then he wrote the following paragraph. It's quite a lengthy paragraph. I'm going to read it in chunks so bits of it can sort of sink in. And as I replied to him, I said, Yazid, I think you've just given me the kernel of a sermon for Christmas morning. And perhaps it's just a seed that's still planting. It's been planted, it's still growing, but let me plant the seed in your heart as well, and then let's see what the Spirit makes of it in our lives over the next few days and weeks. So I wasn't going to mention his name, but I obviously have. So Yazid wrote as follows. The Roman society into which Christ was born is hard to imagine today. A world where the sanctity of life was alien, where disabled children were born to die, where gladiators easily killed and were killed for entertainment. Of course, we might say that things have not really moved on in certain aspects since then, whether in the realms of politics or indeed the sins of the institutional church. But today, no one would take these things for granted without coming up against the moral and imaginative challenges of both European and Middle Eastern history. So I'm going to break there and just unpack that a little bit. It's so easy for us to forget how gentle the world has become and to realize that that's largely because of the impact of the Christ child whose birth we celebrate today. Which is not to say there weren't generous and kind and compassionate people around before Jesus. Of course there were, and there continue to be such people in all faiths. But society took it for granted, as some parts of the world, of course, still do, that if you're a girl, you're of less value, that if you have a disability, you'll be left out to die, that if you're poor, you'll become a slave, or perhaps you'll need to row the large boats that plied backwards and forwards on the Mediterranean until you drop dead down in the bottom of the galley. This was a world where life was cheap. And I've said this in other places, and it's still true, sadly, of too many places on the planet even now. A quarter of all the babies that managed to be born alive died within the first 12 months. And half of those who managed to survive the first 12 months died before their 5th birthday. And half of those who managed to get to 5 years died before they reached puberty. And very few people live beyond about 30 years of age, except for the elite. But they tended to murder and poison each other in the struggle for power. So things kind of evened out, I guess, in a way. Even in our worst moments, the politics in Canberra are nothing like the succession struggles in the house of Herod, or indeed the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The world was a rough and a cruel and a hard place, and remains so, unfortunately, for some people still. But we now see the world differently, and we expect better. We expect better of ourselves, we expect better of our politicians, and we expect the global community to react with compassion when there's a crisis, like COVID and like various other catastrophes in recent decades. The difference is because of Christ. And so let me go back and read a little bit further from that letter. Whether we like to acknowledge it or not, we look at the human world in a framework that Jesus Christ made possible without waging any wars. He had no weapons, he had no soldiers. But simply by changing our perception of what it means to be human and what it means to be God. And that, of course, takes us to the very essence of our celebrations today. The God who comes among us as a human being in the life of Jesus changes not only how we think about God, but also how we think about each other. Any of us could have been chosen to be the incarnation. Perhaps each of us is chosen to be in our own way the presence of God to somebody else in our life. Christmas changes how we see ourselves and how we see the world. And then he went on as follows. I see the greatest witness to this in simple human lives like those of my grandmother. She has known in her flesh and in her nerves what a difference Jesus makes. It is not an easy life, which she did not have. It is more that a transforming love is possible in the midst of all the changes and chances of this fleeting world. And he acknowledges in brackets to use the words of a collect from the Book of Common Prayer. He continues, God is not locked up in technical language or mystical speculation, but is identified with a set of prosaic events to which we are all accountable. This is what calls on us to rise up to the challenge of transforming lives and communities, to cherish and safeguard what we have come to appreciate in modern terms as our freedom and as a life of sacrifice. So Yazid never got to his grandmother's funeral, but he sure gave her a pretty good eulogy a few months afterwards in his Christmas letter. And he was reflecting in those words and some of the other sections of his letter, he was reflecting on the way his grandmother, without doing anything famous, without doing anything spectacular, without ever drawing attention to herself, how his grandmother had lived the reality of Christmas, had lived the reality of Emmanuel, God with us, the reality of the Christ. And the invitation there, I guess, and he sort of touched on it towards the end, is that the invitation is there for us. If we choose to live compassionate lives which reflect the character of Christ, then hope becomes real, worlds are transformed, and lives become meaningful. And we can do that. We don't have to make heroic gestures. We simply have to live the life we have been given with courage, with faith, with hope, and with love. Or to pinch from the bishop's sermon last night, reflecting on the Advent candles, with hope, with peace, with joy, and with love. If we can take those values deep, deep into ourselves and simply live them in quiet, gentle ways, then the world is being transformed one person at a time. Amen.